So the film Loving is based in the 1960s, which tells the story of an interracial couple of Mildred and her significant other, Richard, who fell in love attempting to defy anti-miscegenation laws, showing their commitment as an interracial couple, sparking a historical legal battle resulting in spending the next 9 years fighting for the right to live as a family in their hometown, thereby focusing on the specific character of Mildred Loving and her journey through the challenges and struggles the courts expose her to and the major impact it has on her. So, the three topics I will be discussing is the Cannon-Bard theory, stress, and self-conscious emotion research designs. What does cognitive appraisal mean? It's an individual's subjective perspective of an event. So you have the event, you interpret it, you make a judgment, and therefore the emotion is then elicited. What does physiological mean? It's the body's response to any form or behavior or action. It's the chemical communicating processes in our bodies causing an increase in heart rate or breathing rate. And behavioral, what does that mean? It's characteristic overt expressions that you can read on others, whether that be facial expressions or posture. So, my first emotion topic is the Cannon Bard theory, which is one of the classic theories of emotion created by Walter Cannon and Philip Bard. So, their process of emotion is based off the fact of how a perceived event has to occur first to a person. So, this is being exposed to a stimuli. The stimuli event is perceived by the person, but it's not necessarily being evaluated or in the conscious awareness of the person. Therefore, this occurs before the appraisal of the actual event or stimuli takes place. So, following the perceived event, the individual develops a cognitive appraisal of this event, which causes their emotion. They also experience a feeling aspect, which is recognizing your body's physiological arousal. They also experience the physiological changes, which could be increased heart rate, blood pressure, and behaviors of an emotion, which could be showing the facial expression, posture, and how all these arise separately in reaction to an event. The physiological responses occur simultaneously with this experience of emotion. They don't cause one another, one does not occur first, and one does not inform the other. Even when the body's physiological response, like this increased blood pressure, doesn't occur, the emotion can still be experienced because the physiological arousal is not causing this emotion to be felt. So, Cannon Bard criticized James Lange's theory of emotion because emotions are not in response to an individual's interpretation or recognizing their physiological responses that cause the emotional experience to be felt. Emotions and physiological responses are separate, independent processes which occur at the same time. This is because the body's automatic physiological responses that take place do not occur quick enough in order for the person to recognize this and therefore elicit the emotion to happen instantly. Physiological responses after a perceived event are not mandatory for an individual's emotional experience to be produced. Therefore, in order to apply the Cannon-Bard theory to analyze Mildred Loving, I'm going to be using the emotion of fear. Therefore, the appraisal of fear is any conscious judgment of danger for an individual by interpreting or evaluating the event as dangerous to themselves or potentially dangerous to another individual, therefore, which will trigger the emotion of fear. So, when discussing the behavioral response, which is associated to the Cannon Bard theory, which occurs simultaneously with the emotion that's being felt, the emotion of fear has a clear indication of a facial expression of while they're experiencing this emotion. This could be raising of the eyebrows, the expansion of the eyes, slight opening of the mouth as shown in the picture, and how it differentiates from surprise because it includes the contraction of the eyebrows and lower cheek movement. So, therefore, the physiological responses which are associated to the emotion of fear is caused by the appraising the event as being dangerous or threatening to the person that will therefore trigger these bodily responses. So, therefore, it causes an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, causing a fight or flight response, which is releasing chemicals causing an increase in heart rate, fast breathing, energized muscles. However, Cannon Bard would disagree because he believes these physiological responses occur simultaneously with the emotion of fear. They do not cause one another. So, the background information towards this scene is how authorities have gained knowledge about the illegalized interracial marriage between Mildred Loving and her husband, resulting in them raiding the Lovings' house to arrest them and taking Mildred and her husband to the local jail. So, we first have the perceived event, which is the police breaking into Mildred's house at night, forcing her and her husband to get out of their beds. Mildred perceives this event and is exposed to it, but has not consciously evaluated it yet. Then we can infer that Mildred cognitively appraises the police raiding her house as threatening or dangerous to herself or her husband, and therefore this is causing her to feel the emotion of fear. We can infer from the situation that simultaneously she's experiencing the behavioral response as well as the physiological response, which would be the facial expression of fear as well as experiencing the physiological arousal of increased heart rate and blood pressure in response to the perceived event. However, these physiological responses are not vital in order to the emotion of fear to be felt because they're all arising separately in response to the perceived event, but simultaneously.
So, as for the second example for the Cannon Bard theory,
And we first have the perceived event, which is Mildred being separated from her husband in jail, and therefore she's exposed to this event, but therefore it's not consciously evaluated or appraised quite yet for her. And then we can infer from the situation that Mildred then begins to appraise the event of being separated from her husband in jail as threatening or dangerous as she's alone in the jail cell, and therefore this is causing her to feel the emotion of fear. And then we can infer from the situation that while Mildred is appraising this perceived event as being threatening or dangerous to herself, she's simultaneously exhibiting the behavioral responses of the facial expression of fear alongside the physiological responses of increased heart rate and blood pressure in response to this perceived event.
So, as for the third example for the Cannon-Bard theory,
And then we have the perceived event of Mildred being exposed to her husband being released from jail, and therefore she has not yet cognitively appraised the event. And then we can infer that Mildred is then cognitively appraising this event as being dangerous or threatening to herself or her husband. And then simultaneously, we are aware that she would be expressing the behavioral response of the facial expression of fear alongside the physiological responses which are associated to the fear in response to this perceived event. The second emotion topic that I'm going to be discussing is the topic of stress. And stress is not to be considered an emotion, however, it has a strong effect on an individual's emotion. It's an experience that produces an emotion of fear, anger, grief, and the term fight or flight is used to describe the standard body physiological reactions in response to a stressful event. Hans Sell was the first individual to define stress and therefore create the general adaptation theory. And this is when the body enters into three different stages of the attempt to fight the problem it faces of the stressful event. The alarm stage is the short time frame of intensified arousal of the sympathetic nervous system while discharging cortisol. The resistance stage is where the body maintains this lengthy moderate arousal, continuing to produce cortisol. Whereas exhaustion is where the individual's prolonged drastic challenges it's faced, it enters into weakness, fatigue, lack of motivation, and the long-term struggle the body faces basically goes on to a shutdown mode, and this individual becomes more susceptible to illnesses.
we first talk about Hans Sell and the way he defines stress, and he believes that any significant change in your life stresses you by changing in you in some way. This change can be in any direction, whether it's positive or negative things, this will stress you, and changing back can also cause stress upon you as well.
In relation to Hans Sell, he believes that measuring stress is investigating all the changes that have taken place in someone's life. It's undesirable life changes that cause stress, like the death of the loved one, divorce, losing your job, or desirable life changes causing stress, like the marriage or birth of a child. However, life changes are not all stressful to the same degree. The stressfulness of an event depends on individual circumstances, as well as how people interpret the event, the amount of control they have over it, and what they think they can do about it. So, Bruce McEwen's definition of stress is any event that's interpreted as threatening to an individual, and therefore this interpretation produces a physiological behavioral response. Stress depends on how the individual interprets an event, not just the event itself. Therefore, the difference between the two definitions is how Bruce thinks it's precisely threatening events and how stress is in term of the event. Whereas Hans believes it's all positive and negative life changes, the body's reaction is to change in a person's life. Does stress affect health? Short-term stress is actually beneficial because it increases heart rate, it demands cortisol, it increases blood sugar for a person, and you become very alert. It does not pose a health risk to a person, and how this type of stress is most likely good, and how brief mild stress stimulates a person's awareness, memory, and immune system. However, when we talk about chronic stress and prolonged stress, this is when it affects an individual's physical and mental health. You develop a possibility of ulcers, weakening of the immune system. It causes neurological issues because too much cortisol and it can impact the hippocampus. Because the HPA axis, which is a central stress response system, readies the body for energized action. It stimulates the adrenal release of cortisol, responds slower, and the adrenal cortisol effects last longer. Some background information focuses on the fact of how Mildred goes to Virginia in order to give birth to her first child. However, authorities become noticed about this information and thereby force Mildred and her husband to go back to Washington, where Mildred must accept the fact of where she has to raise her family away from her own. Hans Sel's definition would be applied to this example of stress as Mildred is experiencing a significant life change that's causing stress and altering her in some way. This would be the birth of her first child. Although it's a positive change in her life, it still causes stress amongst her, and the degree of stressfulness would be sufficient as Mildred has to take care of her child alone while her husband is at work. And this uncontrollable crying of her baby, while also trying to accomplish the duties of the household at the same time, is exceeding her capabilities. Therefore, Mildred would be in the alarm stage of the short time frame of intensified arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, increasing blood sugar and in order to supply extra energy to her body. From the second example, that the time in between the last example, years have gone by, and Mildred now has 3 children, and her sister comes to visit her, and Mildred's reaction to her sister arriving shows her immense amount of overwhelmingness. Hans Sel's definition can be applied as this is a significant negative change in her life contributing to her stress, is not being able to go see her family when she wants to, and for them to be able to help provide support to her. and therefore this would be sufficiently stressful because there's nothing she can do about this situation.
So, my third example of stress.
See that it's evident in this example that Mildred has slowly transferred into the resistance stage of maintaining a prolonged arousal, constantly discharging cortisol over the years of raising three children, and how Mildred is being exposed to watching her kids with so much built up energy with nowhere to release it. How Bruce McEwen's example can be used to enhance this thought, as Mildred sees this as threatening to her because there's no grass for her kids to go play in, and therefore it will keep contributing to her stress. And therefore, Hans Sel's definition is the bigger picture, is how this all contributes to the fact of her major negative life change of being forced to move to the city, as opposed to her old home in the country that was the ideal place for Mildred to raise her family. So, example 4. This shows how Mildred has remained in the resistance stage for years while raising her kids and maintaining this prolonged arousal, and how she's slowly transitioning into the exhaustion stage of the general adaptation theory. Her prolonged drastic challenges of the major life changes of having kids, being forced to move away from her family, and the lack of family social support that she needs to relieve stress, her body enters into the exhaustion stage, showing her weakness, fatigue, lack of motivation. The body's long term struggle against threats diminishes. My third topic is self conscious emotion research. And self conscious emotions include pride, guilt, shame, and embarrassment. Self conscious emotions are difficult to study, however, because the elicitors of these emotions are not always distinct, like other emotions are. However, self conscious emotions depend on our own personal experience, culture, and expectations. The elicitors of self conscious emotions are not predictable, along with the reactions produced to circumstances that are expected to elicit a self conscious emotion. The self conscious emotion that I'm going to be discussing is guilt and how it's measured and determined. So, guilt is when one fails or does something morally wrong. They hurt someone, they fail to live up to their one's expectations, and instead they wish they acted in a different way. It's an internal emotion, but it's more related to the event and the behavior for the individual. The individual, you feel bad about a specific action you did, but not who you are as a person. It punishes the person for making the mistakes, but it influences the person to try and fix the damage they have caused. The other self conscious emotion I'm going to be discussing is how shame is measured and determined. So, shame instead is about how you feel about yourself. If you feel negatively about who you are as a person, you're failing to achieve your own personal expectations or character ideals, you think of yourself as essentially bad or unworthy. And how this is different from guilt because it's the way you interpret the event. You interpret the event as guilt of when you think about your behavior or actions, but however, for shame, you interpret it in relation to how you feel about yourself. So, the background information towards this scene is how Mildred is inside with her daughter while her two sons are playing outside by themselves on the busy streets, and her one son gets hit by a car. This first example of guilt is shown as Mildred is feeling guilty about her son who has just gotten hit by a car. She's showing the facial expression of guilt of her eyes being lowered and hunched posture, and she feels that she has failed, seeing her mistake of behavior as failing to live up to the ones of expectations of being a mom and looking out for her kids, and thereby punishing herself for this mistake of not going outside with her kids and letting them go and play by themselves outside in the busy street, and feeling that she wished she acted differently. So, therefore, we can infer from this situation that Mildred is still experiencing her feeling of guilt, of lowered eyes and hunched posture, feeling responsible for choosing the life of moving her family to the city instead of living in the country, since it's not a safe and controlled environment to raise children. However, the value of guilt is shown in this example as it influences Mildred to try and fix the damage suffered by telling her husband that they need to move back to the country. Where the last self conscious emotion is shame, and we can infer that Mildred feels negatively about herself and unworthy or how she may be perceived by her husband. If only I were a better mother, I'm not good enough. It's failing to live up to her character ideals of being a mom. And as we can see through her facial expression, her lowered eyes, her hunched posture, the corners of her mouth turned down, it's the attributing of these negative events as relating it to herself as a person and how she feels, as well as globally, how these thoughts would lead to her sense of failure, resulting in her inability to act or deal with many situations. The first self conscious emotion research design focuses on individual differences of self conscious emotions regarding age. So, early beliefs of self conscious emotions was that only adults were able to experience them. However, current research says otherwise, that children are also able to as well. However, one important skill for certain emotional experiences is the ability to differentiate the self from others. A person has to be able to acknowledge that they're their own being and that someone else is separate from them. So, this is specifically in relation to young children who are not yet developmentally formed to have the capacity for self differentiation. Once an individual has formed a sense of self and acknowledges the fact that they are separate and that their own thoughts and feelings are unique from others, then they have the ability to experience self conscious emotions. When studying self conscious emotions and age, a research focus regarding self reflection and differentiation is empathy. So, the definition of empathy is to feel the same emotion as another person. So, elements of empathy is believed to emerge as early as the first year of life, when babies start touching another baby who is in distress, or babies crying at the sound of another baby crying. By age 2, a child's reaction to another child's distress is to comfort them similar to the way they like being comforted. By age 3, children can even execute comfort that's suitable to another child's needs. Overall, this is the empathetic feeling and the ability to contrast between the self and other.
The second self conscious emotion research design is self conscious emotions and health. So, some emotions are significantly correlated to depression. This would be sadness, shame, and guilt. It's reported that deep shame that is unable to be changed is significant to some people's depression.
So, the third self conscious emotion research design focuses on individual differences between gender and self conscious emotions. There is research demonstrating gender differences in the evaluation of a person's own behavior. Individuals will ask themselves, did the event result from my own action? So, for males, evidence suggests that when males experience success, they blame themselves. But when they experience failure, then blame is placed elsewhere, to external factors. However, oppositely for females, females blame themselves for failure, that the event resulted from their own action. So blame is placed elsewhere, however, to external factors in regards to their own success.